Hi everybody, welcome to part 2, talking about some of the theory behind how I talk about video games. Last episode we were talking about games criticism and how I approach criticizing games, how I think about it. Today we're going to talk about game balance and how I approach that. My approach to game balance is like this: adaptation, buffing, nerfing. So what do I mean by that? The best games that exist, in my opinion, allow for player adaptation to problems. A perfect example of this to me is Smash Bros. Melee. It's a game that has almost no patch history, but has had significant changes in the tier list over the years. For a long time, it was considered kind of Fox Falco only, were the only top tier characters, and man, has that changed. It's super interesting to see Puff at the top of these tier lists nowadays. Marth had his day. There was a lot of changes in what people felt were powerful because there was a lot of adaptation happening in the community around the game. And games that are designed well allow for a breadth and depth of user adaptation, not the game developer adapting the game to make things, to touch the numbers, but players coming up with counter strategies. Now that said, within the realm of adaptation, I also believe that there's a developer way of encouraging adaptation. If a game, for example, has a certain mechanic that is not interactable, for some reason there's something that a certain character can do and there's no direct way of interacting with that mechanic, that would be bad game design, and because anything that is not directly interactable is lowering the agency of players and lowers the adaptability of players. A way that a developer could encourage adaptability is by adding game mechanics that allow for adaptability. A great example that comes to mind for me is Bloodhound Step in Elden Ring. This mechanic has very specific windows of interaction, but is generally a quite non-interactive ability because it's highly mobile, highly invincible, and very difficult to deal with. If the developer were to add to a game a specific parry where if your opponent was using some sort of mobility move, say Bloodhound Step or Quick Step, within a certain radius, and you were to kind of essentially parry in an AoE around you, and that stunned them out of that animation, that would be adding a mechanic to the game that is allowing for direct adaptation to a specific strategy. So in the realm of adaptation, the first thing that I always want to see is player-based adaptation, but acknowledging that player-based adaptation often requires game developers designing their games in the correct way to allow for adaptation. Now, what happens when adaptation fails? Especially in modern gaming, the truth is that a lot of game developers simply don't design their games very well and don't design certain mechanics to have direct interaction with other mechanics. So if there's something in the game that is non-interactable, doesn't have a direct counter, what is the solution? Well, my first solution would be buffing. So one of the things I really liked that Elden Ring did in patch 1.04 is that the majority of that patch was simply buffing things. It was buffing the majority of things that were in the kind of low, mid-range, things that weren't actually that powerful. And one of the things that we really saw as a result of that is a lot of, especially incantations that weren't being used before in PvP, started getting used in PvP because they casted a little bit faster, they hit a little bit harder. In my opinion, this is the best way of balancing things. If something is too powerful, bringing up the power level of everything else is the best option. Because what this does is this allows for a larger variety of play without removing a specific strategy. And lastly, we come to nerfing. Nerfing is one of the things that gamers generally hate the most, whether they understand it or not. Nerfing taps into one of the most primal urges of human beings, which is loss aversion. Something that has been said and well studied is that people fear loss more than they anticipate gain. A better way of putting that is, if you find $100 on the street, that feels, let's say, 100 good. But if you were to lose $100, that feels 200 bad. And so there is this very deep concept within people to avoid loss. It's one of the reasons that we have the entire idea of the sunk cost fallacy. which is that, well, I've invested in something and I don't want to lose what I currently have, even though sometimes it actually makes sense to lose what you currently have. But because of that, a smart game developer will try and avoid nerfing things pretty much at all costs, because this is just going to piss off their fan base. Nobody likes using something, feeling powerful, and then feeling disempowered. Obviously, the best solution is to not design things to be overpowered and to do balance testing yourself so that you don't release games in an overpowered state. But sometimes it happens that there are things that come out and are just overpowered compared to everything else. So in my opinion, it is a last resort to nerf something. When I talk about things being overpowered, when I talk about things being broken in a certain game, what I want to do in the future going forward is actually make it a lot more clear that this is how I understand how game balance should be done, and offer suggestions in this kind of order. Some people, specifically when it came to my Bloodhound Step videos, saw me suggesting nerfing / removal as a sort of knee-jerk or extreme reaction. My personal opinion is that unless FromSoft is willing to add a direct mechanical counter to Bloodhound Step, which I would definitely be my preferred answer, it is an example of a mechanic in a game where buffing other options just wouldn't give you equal interaction, because Bloodhound Step is unique in the game in that it is the best mobility ability, it's the best dodge, it has the most speed, it takes very little FP. It is an ability that is far out of range of everything else in the game, and there's nothing that compares to it, and there's nothing that can really directly interact with it as a mechanic. Because of that, the only real options in that specific setting are to add a specific counter mechanic to those dashing spells, or dashing Ash of Wars, or to nerf / remove them. In my ideal world, game developers don't buff or nerf or do anything to games. In my personal opinion, I think that developers need to take a far more hands-off approach with their games and allow communities the time and the ability to create adaptations to powerful strategies. The catch with this is that if things are too powerful and don't have good enough counters, this can kill your game. There are specific situations where I think that developers need to directly intervene in order to prolong the longevity of their game, because not every player is going to want to invest the time and the energy to create adaptations to things that are very powerful and very broken. So there's a bit of a balancing act going on there. So again, to reiterate, my theory of game balance is adaptation, developer adaptation, I guess, buffing, then lastly nerfing or removal. And I think that generally if game developers follow this kind of cycle, that they're going to come out with a lot more exciting, interactive games where the players can feel that sense of, we are the ones dictating the meta, we are the ones creating counters and changing what's overpowered. Okay, if that's overpowered, then we can build this counter build and that's going to ruin that. That sort of interaction is where games, in my opinion, are at their best, where the playing community feels that sense of high agency and is able to say, I can make the adaptations I need to be able to beat that thing that beats me.